So we were recording. Obviously got that notification. Also, we do have transcript available if you want to click on the bottom. If it's not showing, you can either get it to hide or get it to show. I think it was one of the things I've always forget to tell you guys. But we'll start off. I am Eric Roberts, Dr. Eric Roberts with the Center for Disability and Development, and we are with the Capacity Building Project. Very excited to have y'all here. We know a lot of the school folks are pretty busy, so we wanted to kind of focus on something that would be a bit more broadly, for a lot of our Texas workforce people, that kind of things that would really help y'all out. And so we got Jeanette Smith here. Jeanette Smith is someone that's been working in the school districts for quite a while and doing evaluations on students. And so we wanted her to come and kind of talk about what that looks like and how we can use those. Because we know oftentimes we see them and we're not quite sure, how to read them, and then even if we can know how to read them, how we can actually use them for support for our students in work environments. And so she's going to cover that. And so just before I get started, sorry, Jeanette, I sound like I was introducing you, and I'm going to tell you a couple of things. So next month we will be going over kind of the basics of ARDS, which I know school districts, you got it. But a lot of times our Texas workforce and other organizations, they might not. So if you want to invite them to attend this, I think that'd be really helpful for them. We're going to go over, we've listened to Thielen, who's going to go over all the acronyms and just kind of the parts that we have to have in there and help people understand kind of, what goes on in ARD and understand the language that's being used in those things that can be really confusing if you don't live it day to day. Like a lot of the school people do. And then we get families in there and they don't know, and we think they know, right? And we have a lot of people from the workforce and other organizations we think they know and they don't know. I know I had an ARD meeting with one of my 18 plus students, and so this was his graduation ARD, and then the mom was like, and what does that mean? And it was like one of his categories for his disability, and it's like, oh my goodness, like he's been doing this is like 22 years old, and you did not know, there's something very, very important about his ARD. And so we're hoping that'll help out with that. We hope that this will help out people understanding more about the FIEs and the reads and the evaluations that go into school districts. And I'm going to post Jeanette's PowerPoint. Also, I'm going to post something. We have a new program coming up I talked about last time. And then also a link that you can share to register for our next event. So, I think that's it. All right. You ready to go, Jeanette?
I am. So thank you guys for having me, Dr. Roberts. And so just like you said, a lot of this for me is kind of my day-to-day. And so I think in evals, I kind of speak in evals, but I do often realize that I'm throwing information at people that they've never heard of before, or they've never heard in these terms. And so hopefully you're able to kind of walk away understanding some of this information a little bit better. And again, how you can help individuals that you're working with. And so we're going to kind of demystify the process for any of you that have ever been confused by a psychoeducational evaluation before. And so just kind of jumping into the initial kind of components of it, right? Essentially, our objective when we're evaluating in the schools is what? We're really looking to figure out a student's strengths and weaknesses, how they function cognitively. So how do they process information? Where do they stand academically compared to their peers? And the end goal for gathering all that information for us, because this can vary from outside agencies, right? Our objective is to determine whether or not a student meets a disability condition. And so later on, as we're kind of looking through the slides, we'll really kind of review what those are in terms of IDA and the SPED laws that kind of govern what we do on a day-to-day, because it does differ slightly from what you might see in private practice. And so that might be confusing for some of y'all too, when you go, I know a student to have these diagnoses. I know him to have, I don't know, what did I use the other day? Reactive attachment disorder, but it's not in the conclusion of this report. It's a little outside of the scope of what we're looking for in schools. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later. But essentially that's our objective. Does this student have a disability? And then with that information we've collected, we need to be able to determine whether or not a student, because of this disability condition, they're now being impacted academically in the school setting, right? How do we support them? Is there an educational need for programming? And so that's ultimately what you're going to find within a report. A lot of information broken down into a lot of sections geared towards answering these two questions. And this is all before you even go to ARD. and review it and kind of make recommendations for things. This is kind of the preface for that, right? You need to know that the information is in here so that then you can make recommendations at a place like an art committee. Like Dr. Roberts mentioned, in the state of Texas, our evaluations are referred to as FIEs, full and individual evaluations. So you'll hear that term thrown out a lot. They are updated every 3 years. And this is where it gets tricky sometimes for individuals that don't work in the field, you know, across the cubicle from me, is that sometimes they're referred to with different acronyms. And so READ is one you may hear thrown out there from time to time. And it's essentially a review of existing evaluation data. It is still or can be a standalone evaluation if ultimately the review of the information available is that a student continues to present with characteristics of whatever their previous evaluation said. And so sometimes, and the outside practice, you guys may have a read that lands on your desk. It is also an evaluation. Sometimes it includes formal data, informal data. And so I think that's where, again, it gets a little bit confusing for folks that don't work in the field as I do, because you're expecting to always see current, updated, formal, achieve, so cognitive and achievement testing, those kind of things. But a read might encompass more of reviewing what you already have available for you, okay? So just kind of so you can start throwing that into your vernacular as reports land on your desk. And like I said, it's done every 3 years. And so if you have a student who's been in the system for quite some time and been receiving services for quite some time, and you have their most recent eval, or maybe you have one from when they were 8 or 9, and now you're working with them when they're 18, there may be more digging that you can do to achieve or gain access to some of those additional reports. And so I also throw out there that there's the possibility of gaining a consent for disclosure of confidential information for you to obtain that from the school district if you don't have that available to you already, those additional reports. So next question kind of becomes, what is included in a full and individual evaluation? What is in these school-based reports? What should I be looking for? And so the sections typically look very similar to kind of what's included here. And so you're going to find background information, sociological and health information, communication, behavioral data, depending on the need of the student. This may be informal, coupled with formal data. It may be more informal, but it still gives you insightful information about how a student was performing in terms of their regulation in the environment that they were in, their ability to navigate relationships with others, those kind of things. But it is kind of going to vary depending on what eligibility we were looking for. Cognitive abilities, academic functioning, adaptive, and then you'll always see conclusions and recommendations. These may not always mirror exactly what a student might have on their ARD paperwork. So in other words, whatever was accepted by the ARD committee. These are recommendations we make as practitioners, but sometimes by the time you go to ARD, there's other individuals that have stakeholder kind of claim in the scenario, and they may bring some other recommendations to the table, and those are the ones that are adopted at ARD. So you may see them, but then you don't see them on the paperwork following the student. So just, that's my caveat to you. In terms of background information, you're really going to find some information that's relevant to why the student was evaluated to begin with. So what struggles was the student presenting with? What were some of the difficulties? Is this an evaluation that is being done as a reevaluation? So more that kind of read process, we're reviewing existing data. And so we already know the student to have an eligibility condition, and we're updating some things. So this section is really going to give you information about that. And then it'll be coupled kind of in a separate section with sociological information. And so again, how does the student navigate the environment at home independently? What are the needs there, behaviors? And so this is always relevant to us as we're attempting to navigate whether or not the student has a disability condition that's impacting them in multiple locations and not just in the school setting. And so the relevance to your field would really be that, well, what does the student look like outside of the scope of maybe the supports that they're receiving in the school setting? And so if your environment is maybe more reflective of the independence you would expect to see a student present in the home setting, in the community setting, you may have some information in this particular section of the report that's vital for you, right? What are the parents indicating are their biggest concerns with the student? What kind of progress has a student have demonstrated over time? And so again, kind of food for thought for y'all as you're thinking of how you're beginning to establish a relationship or maintain that with maybe now an adult individual or maybe an adult student, depending on the age. The next section is really going to be communication. I just included in here kind of some of the broad areas that you're going to find within this section. It really depends on the need of the student, but I really emphasize the pragmatic piece. Expressive is obviously their use of language. Are they able to communicate with others? Are they able to get their needs met by way of communicating them appropriately to other individuals? Receptive really speaks more to the understanding of language. So when another is communicating with this individual, are they able to understand the way that we would expect them to? Are there needs for adjusting and adapting the communication style, the words that are used? Again, vital for you, especially as you're working with individuals who may or may not have an awareness of these difficulties in themselves. You may be asking them to do certain things that most individuals understand the first time you communicate it to them, but perhaps you need to adjust your communication style to this individual, or inform other individuals that will be working with them of that need. And then the biggest section that really impacts the majority of the students that I work with, I evaluate a lot of students on the spectrum, is that pragmatic language. So the ability to follow rules, understand some of those hidden rules, understand turn taking, how to speak to different individuals, and even the proximity, so that space between another when you're communicating. This may be probably more along the lines of what you'll see with some of the individuals that you work with, is that if this is a skill that is not well developed, again, what does that mean for you in terms of how you support them moving forward? This may be an individual that really needs to have some of those hidden rules of a workplace, of a college setting, of whatever environment you're kind of helping them transition into. And so you may really have to work through those things with them. Perhaps expressive and receptive seems intact and you're able to hold a conversation with them according to what your expectations are. But when you peel back the layers, and presumably in this evaluation, you should have some of that information, you realize that it's all very scripted and they've learned some coping strategies, but that doesn't mean they always understand the nuances of how to generalize those things into other settings. And so again, this is information you should be able to find within the communication section. You may have one that's very simple and to the point, and it says communication skills are intact. Fantastic. Then you know that that's really not an area of concern for your individual. But if you don't and you have something that's a little bit more thorough, it's definitely vital information for you to kind of tease through and think about what that means for you moving forward in planning with that person. Okay. The next one really talks about behavior. And so this is kind of the meat and potatoes for what it is that I do on a day-to-day basis. And so it's really teasing through and delineating exactly how an individual presents in some of these areas. Maybe all together, maybe just some of them. It really depends on the eligibility that we were looking for. And so we'll talk about eligibilities in a minute. But these may include inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. So think individuals that maybe have ADHD, right? What does that look like for them in the classroom? What are the struggles that they have? Are these individuals that are told a directive and 5 minutes later they forget it, that maybe struggle with initiating tasks because their movement is such that they're not paying attention to what's going on around them? A lot of this information will be presented in this area for you to extract and understand what an individual looks like, again, in the school setting, but what that then means for you when you're working with them out of that environment. How we may need to help support them or provide them some additional skills or kind of foundational kind of accommodations and things. Other things we might be looking for are more of those oppositional behaviors, those externalizing behaviors that sometimes can get one in trouble, aggression as well. And so again, that gives you insight on the potential for an individual to struggle with self-regulation, with calming oneself down, with taking information that is not pleasant to us and knowing how to respond accordingly, right? Maybe this is not the time and place to show my boss that I'm frustrated, and so I respond in this way. How do they kind of navigate when those circumstances present themselves? This section is really going to give you some insight on your individual about where their skills are, or maybe the growth that they've already had, right? We've grown to now be able to do these things. These are additional areas that we need to grow in. You may have information about anxiety, depression, withdrawal, some somatic complaints. So some maybe instances where the student is seeking to leave the environment that they're in, again, that's vital information for you to know that if the individual you're working with becomes overwhelmed and their natural response is to attempt to maybe leave the environment that they're in, that's vital for you to kind of know in terms of planning with them moving forward to ensure that you have systems in place so that if that does occur, they know where their outlets are. Where can I go in a situation like that to try to kind of gather myself and return to task? You may have, again, some indications of some social problems, some maybe erroneous thought patterns, some atypicality. So maybe I engage in behaviors that others consider to be odd, but those are just natural to who I am as an individual. That's insightful, again, for you to know about the individual so that we're not responding excessively, maybe for something that's just a natural propensity for that person for their disability condition. Okay. Another section that may be embedded, especially when we're talking about individuals with some behavioral difficulties or even with ADHD, is that component of executive functioning. So I always explain this to parents as kind of that powerhouse that explains to individuals how to navigate themselves in a variety of different environments, right? That includes managing myself, knowing where to start tasks, knowing how to move forward through tasks, knowing how to navigate and manage my emotions. So all of those things are really incorporated in executive functioning. It's not all just attention and remaining focused at all times. It's all of these other minute components that fall into this category as well. And so you may find information that indicates to you that your individual really struggles with organizing information, but follow through is really good for me, right? At that I have a handle on. And so you're able to support me in figuring out how to break down a task in such a way that then I can actually complete it. My ability to follow through with it is there. It's just those components of becoming overwhelmed with too much information, or again, knowing where to start. It's just so much that I don't know which task becomes most relevant and most important to kind of move forward from there. So again, so very relevant information for you to look for within that behavior section. Cognitive abilities. And so this is going to be one of the generally largest areas that you see when you're looking into evaluations. And again, I have been kind of throwing out some terms in terms of disability conditions as I've been talking, but when you're thinking of a student who has an intellectual disability or potentially a specific learning disability, people use the term for all disabilities very broadly and they call them learning disabilities, but there is a very specific eligibility condition, which is specific learning disability. You are going to see reports with a lot of scores and a lot of numbers, and we'll talk a little bit about what those numbers mean, because I know for most people that's where you put the report back where you found it and you don't look at it again. But they give you a lot of very relevant information. And so for the most part, the way that you will see this area broken down, especially in the state of Texas, is into 7 abilities. You may see it as 5 because sometimes evaluators will utilize batteries, especially for intellectual disability evaluations, where the battery that they're using does not incorporate auditory processing and long-term memory, but it does incorporate all the other components. But I went ahead and just gave you a little bit of data about what each area really encompasses and what that might look like in vivo for an individual that you're working with. It's vital information for you to understand how they process information. Many years ago, individuals were really leaning heavily on strictly looking at the IQ score for an individual and having that be the overarching way that they then thought that the person could process or function or where their needs might be. And that's still the relevant case for some individuals, especially for those with maybe an intellectual disability, since that is one of the components of determining eligibility conditions. However, you may have an individual who their overarching IQ score appears low, for what we know of the numbers, right? Appears low, but when you really start to tease it out, and you look through their cognitive abilities from the lens of individual areas, you notice that they may have, yes, some strengths and some weaknesses, but the strengths are ones that really we could utilize to our advantage, to their advantage, in terms of helping to create goals, helping to establish some systems for them to be able to use those strengths and really maximize those to help them move forward. And so the areas are broken down into verbal comprehension. It's coined as many things. You can hear it as crystallized knowledge, crystallized intelligence. Essentially what it is your overall encompassing information that you've acquired through your experiences. So we've all read books. I think we have. We've all read books. We've all, been out and about with our parents at zoos and museums and things like that. We all have different cultural experiences. And so we're all learning something through those experiences. It includes our vocabulary that we're picking up, all of those things. And so I just kind of broke it down for y'all so that later, when you have forgotten everything I said today, you can at least go back to these slides and go, okay, there is some meat there in me figuring out how to help this individual. What does that area, that cognitive area, tell me about this individual? And so it gives you a little bit of insight that for individuals who really struggle here, they may struggle with some word knowledge. I don't know what that word is. I've never heard it before. It's not part of my experiences in my life. And so we maybe need to adapt and adjust the way we communicate with that individual, because it's more of a lack of kind of exposure to those things. They may struggle with retrieving some acquired information. It's information that I can't tie into things because I've never experienced that before. And it also helps you know how to work with them and maybe presenting them with some additional coping mechanisms and strategies to recall things that they need once you're kind of placing them within a position of, again, either vocation or university setting. Let me kind of teach you a little bit about this so that it can become part of your acquired knowledge, and maybe later you can more readily tie information to it. So it's all relevant data in moving forward with an individual. Auditory processing really talks about how they are able to encode information they hear auditorily. And so again, for you, if you're looking at the numbers, and I have a nice report to show you, so hopefully that's helpful. You're looking at numbers, and this is an area of weakness for an individual. What it really tells you is that perhaps this is not an individual that you solely want to communicate with orally. Perhaps you want to find another method to provide them information, include that in the recommendations you make for whatever placement you end up facilitating for an individual. But this is someone who works better with checklists, with things being written down, with being given visuals of information. That is a better way to provide them the knowledge you want them to then be able to retrieve at a later date. So it's vital to know that about someone. Long-term memory really talks about being able to store information, but then also retrieve it. So sometimes you'll see this in reports broken down into two areas, which is the storage part of it and then the retrieval part of it. For the sake of today, I added it all together because ultimately it's one skill and one ability. But it does also, again, tell you so much about an individual. If this is an area of weakness, what it tells you is that you need to figure out a way to help them encode these things a little bit differently. Again, is there something I can tie this to that they're already aware of that's very common for them, so that this information doesn't just kind of slip away from them, or so that they're able to find it when they need it? And if we're not able to get them to that place, again, figuring out how to provide them that data in such a way that they're able to access it later. So this is probably an opportune time to teach this information via some notes. Here's an additional copy of what you need. Here's where you can find it. Ensure that they're writing things down and ensuring that individuals that work with them know this about them. You may express everything you need to this individual and they will shake their head along and look like they're understanding everything, and they may be. But if you really want to ensure that long-term they have access to this information, let's make sure that we are also providing them some additional manners in which they can kind of retrieve this information on paper, on a flash drive, via email, what have you. Working memory really speaks to more the information that you retain for that short amount of time to do something with. So every single one of us has had someone try to give us their email address just orally, and you go, wait, let me write this down. I'm not going to remember. And some are wonderful at this, but it really talks about, again, holding on to information for a very temporary amount of time, very short amount of time, to manipulate it, do something with it. And so again, vital for you to know about an individual. Sometimes you may have individuals that come to your office or that you're working with, and they have very poor working memory, but very good long-term retrieval, or vice versa. And so again, it's vital for you to know where they kind of stand, because you may not realize that you can have that discrepancy, that someone cannot remember something for 5 minutes, but they can once they've learned it and once they've been able to encode it in whatever manner is appropriate for them, they're able to retrieve it later. So it's good for you to know that. It's good for you to understand that. Next. we talk about some of the other abilities. So fluid reasoning really talks about being able to process information that's new to us, right? So problem solving, this really feeds a lot into math. And so this is, again, something that you'll see when you start looking into scores. And so there may be an individual who, for all intents and purposes, is able to articulate and communicate with you beautifully. But as soon as something comes up that they've never really been presented with before, I used that word generalization earlier, then they just become stagnant and they freeze and don't necessarily know what to do and do not understand how to locate other information that's relevant to that scenario, whether it's because they've never been in that situation before or because, again, problem solving is just too complex for them. And so this is one of those areas that's, again, important for you to understand, because this is where some people crumble, right? If I can't figure out how to collect all the pieces to resolve this particular task, then I may just not do it. And that doesn't always necessarily need to be the response, but they may not know otherwise, right? Visual spatial, so similar to the auditory processing, this is individuals and how their ability to be able to decode information, manipulate it, analyze it visually. Okay, and so we do have some individuals who struggle with doing this, and so they never had a puzzle in their hand. I always say give people puzzles. It's good for visual spatial learning. But some of the difficulties that they may have is, again, just some discrimination visually, and so they may really struggle with looking at information you're presenting them and being able to kind of extract and tease out what it is that they need. And so another important element for you to understand in terms of whether it's, again, placing them at the university setting or placing them in a work environment, understanding that they may need information presented to them in a more concrete manner. So these are the key elements that you kind of need to know for you to kind of complete this task, whatever that might be, versus giving them a lot and expecting for them to be able to discriminate between what they're seeing. This is always tricky when you have individuals who struggle auditorily and visually, which you may see, and it's quite a combination, but it just speaks to the need for what visuals you do provide, ensure that they're broken down to kind of the most base element that they can be without having it be an overwhelming amount of information. And then processing speed is usually the last area that you see in this section. Really talks about how quickly an individual is able to do a task. And usually when we do this assessment, it's timed. And so what I've noticed with some individuals is that they're able to complete the task. It's the timed component that really trips them up. And so you will get to know your individuals as you're working with them, and you may realize that this person has all the capability of completing this task or any task that's presented to them, but the time it takes them to complete it is longer than most. And so then you plan for that. You know this about them. You maybe place them in environments where that is an availability. They have the ability to kind of think through a little bit more what they're going to type of environment may not be the best for them, or that's something that needs to be articulated, like if they're at a university setting with professors and individuals that are going to require for them to complete work. I may need a little bit more time to process this information. I can get there, but it may just take me a little bit extra time, okay? And so that's cognitive abilities. All this to say that the reason we're digging into cognitive abilities is to see, one, whether or not there's a disability condition, but also how those cognitive abilities, looking to see where the student is compared to their peers. And so again, we'll talk about norms and standards and things like that in a little bit. But this area can be informal or formal. The informal data is really going to be information that's provided from, can you still hear me? my internet unstable situation is clicking on my computer. Anyway, so the academic pieces here in terms of informal data might be grades, information from the teachers, information from state assessments, things of that nature. And the state assessment is always going to be kind of this isolated moment in time, what have you. And so you're going to analyze that data as necessary. But the formal assessments that we do really try to tease out where a student is compared to other individuals, their grade level, with assessments that are normed nationwide. So most fifth graders, most ninth graders, most 12th graders, what have you, are scoring about in this range on this assessment. where does this individual fall? And so it's vital information for us to have because it tells us about progression, right? If we're thinking about most individuals and the instruction that they're receiving, where does this individual fall with this particular skill? They may have a relative strength to themselves. So relative meaning I struggle with decoding and comprehension, but fluency is really good. So relative to myself, those other areas are weaknesses, but fluency is a strength. With the formal assessments that we do, we're not looking so much for relative strengths or weaknesses, we're looking for normative. Where are you compared to everyone else that was used for these norming standards on this assessment? And so reading is broken down significantly. There's so many components of reading. For the sake of the eligibility conditions that we have, we really look extensively at the decoding, the comprehension, and the fluency. So how does an individual understand the dynamics of the letter sound recognition, patterns, blending, all those kind of things? If they can do those things, what does their comprehension then look like? And then again, the fluency, the rate with which they're reading. And so this is again important information for y'all, as you may have students that reading is quite difficult and laborious. Maybe I can get there, but my fluency is not great. And so it does impact comprehension. I have to go back and I have to read multiple times. And so you knowing this about them, perhaps being in an environment where it's very reading heavy is not going to be the best fit for them. Perhaps instructions need to be presented to them orally versus giving them very long lists of things. Many of these individuals are taught some coping strategies. So how do you jot down relevant information? Not all are. So you'll have to kind of figure out your individuals you're working with them. That ties into the writing. So writing is really going to encompass spelling and written expression. And so this is an area that, again, could be weak for an individual. And so they may struggle with having to write very lengthy documents or lists or things like that. And so you'll gain information about a student's skill and individual skill in this area about where they fall with reading, writing, and then the math. So again, just kind of relevant for you to look for. Adaptive functioning is an area that's often overlooked by most people because it's confusing to most people. But I will say that it's very relevant, mainly because it talks about independence. It talks about skills that you can do without support, without prompting, without cueing. Where do you fall compared to, again, individuals that were used to norm the products? There's generally about 2 that I usually use that are different rating scales, where we're collecting information from individuals in your life and asking them based on their interactions with you, how well you do these particular things. And so they're broken down into social components of your day-to-day, practical components of your day-to-day. So think your ability to navigate your day-to-day environment, work environment, school environment, your home environment, safety. Does this individual know that we shouldn't put our hands on a hot stove? Questions that kind of fall in that range. And then again, communication. So am I able to communicate my needs to others? Am I able to get my point across? Am I able to navigate relationships with others? Those kind of things. And so this area is very relevant to how you work with individuals because it really speaks to how much support they may or may not need in order to successfully complete some of the tasks that you are asking them to do or environments that you're placing them in. Some of the areas that can be teased out of adaptive functioning are things like grooming, dressing, safety, food handling, school rules, or just the rules of the environment that they're in. So there are questions that are geared towards the parent that really lie heavily on whether or not their individual is aware of safety in public, of stranger danger. It's probably not a term that's used within the actual protocol, but essentially the concept of stranger danger. Do they understand when they should or should not interact excessively with an individual that's unfamiliar to them? And so definitely, again, relevant information for y'all, their ability to work. One of the protocols for parents, especially as individuals gain in age, is specific to the work environment. Does this individual have a job? Were they able to fill out a job application? And so it really talks about how independently people can do these things. Money management, cleaning, making friends, again, social skills, and then personal responsibilities. So it's caring for themselves beyond just caring for another individual. So this information is very useful for, again, the day-to-day. How heavily handed will we need to be with this individual? Will this be an individual where maybe as I'm creating goals for the future, I need to really take into consideration that this person is going to need more guidance than another same age individual, same gender individual, same individual came from the same school setting, school environment, so perhaps was exposed to many of the same supports, right? This may provide you a little bit of additional information in terms of the practical life needs of an individual. And so these are relevant always to the school setting, but the school setting also has such strict expectations that where we really start to kind of see, I don't want to call it cracks in the foundation, but probably in that ability to generalize is in this particular area once individuals go into out of school environments. Okay, so a very good area in the report for you guys to be looking. So you see a lot of scores. They don't always make sense. You don't always know what they're telling you. But essentially, when you're looking at a psychoeducational evaluation, so an FIE, full individual evaluation, you are going to be looking at information that's norm referenced, right? So we're looking at how you performed on assessments when we're comparing you to other individuals that are your same grade and same age. But you're also going to look at some information that's standardized. And so that's where sometimes it gets a little bit confusing for folks that don't do what I do every day. And so the reason it gets kind of tricky is because you will see things like this. Okay. And I included it here because, again, later you will not remember what I said, but at least you can refer to this slide. Oftentimes, what you'll notice in the cognitive area of an evaluation, sometimes you see this in the achievement section as well, are descriptive classification charts like this. At least I hope you do, because they do provide you information. So you're not completely foreign to what's going on. But they can be confusing because if more than one tool was used, as you can tell from the two that I included, average does not mean the same for both of these tools. And so again, this is information that's specific to that battery in terms of the individuals they use to create this battery, and they use their information to determine what they consider to be average, low average, high average, so on and so forth. And so when you're looking at these kind of scores, while the battery has normative data and normative samples, the standardization, the descriptions of how they're describing that data may look a little bit different. And so I'm going to show you guys something that to me seems much more useful as we kind of move forward through these slides. Norm reference information may include things like percentile ranks, standard scores, IQ tests. As we saw in the previous slide, batteries can have different ranges for their standardized scores and what they mean. And so hopefully the visual that I have for you provides you a little bit more insight as you kind of move forward about how you can conceptualize the skills of the individuals that you're working with beyond just looking at a number, okay? And so percentile ranks really just kind of talks about, again, where an individual ranks. And so you'll hear or read in reports where it says, this student performed in the 50th percentile rank. Okay, well, what does that mean? Is that a 50s and Fs? Did they do very poorly? What does that mean in the grand scheme of what I need to know? Or in the 91st percentile, 3rd percentile, what does that mean? And so for the 50th, to give you an example, it just means that this individual, again, was as good or better than 50% of same age peers. Okay. And so that may be very beneficial information for you when you're thinking of it in those terms, that if a student was in the 3rd percentile in basic reading, and we're the age that we are now, the age they're working with you, 18, and that's the most recent assessment that I have for this individual, that means that they are performing as good or better than 3% of same age peers. So that's an incredible area of weakness for that person, that you can start to kind of think of data in that way as you're moving forward and working with individuals. And it can tell you more sometimes than the standard score. Okay, so it's vital for you to understand percentile ranks when they're included in the report, because sometimes they are not. So again, my caveat to you. The next section, again, talks about those standard scores. And so, again, this allows for comparison of the student on different types of tests. It tells you, again, based on this assessment that was used, this is where the student fell within this assessment. And then IQ scores are going to give you that global range. And so the reason that I still included it here, even though I had my spiel earlier about how IQ scores don't always give you the best representation for a student, there is still some need and use for the data that it tells you. The bigger use for me in terms of your day-to-day and what you need to understand about the individuals you work with is here, this notion that talks about scores being average at 100, right? And generally one standard deviation is about 15 points up or down, either way. And so the relevance to you is that when you're looking at data and you're able to use more of this format to break down and understand where an individual falls, as you can see where it says standard score, 100 being right at average, 15 points up, right? So in the positive trajectory is heading into some pretty positive skills, right? High, average, superior, very superior. So being able to conceptualize the information you see in reports in this manner helps you to understand that beyond just the number, what it should be representing that number is an individual either does very well in this area or very poorly in this area. We're heading in the opposite direction. So if you see a 77, if you see a 69, sometimes they all just look like numbers. And again, we don't understand where they're supposed to fall, what that's supposed to mean for us. 85s. What that's telling you is that your individual that you're working with, their ability in that area, whether it was moving in a positive trajectory from the mean, which is most people, or in a negative trajectory. Is this something that's going to be a skill deficit for them or a strength for them? Where do they kind of fall? And so that helps you to start conceptualizing data in that kind of a way. When I'm thinking about what I see, is this something that is telling me that the student can perform in this area well, or that they're going to struggle and we're going to need to support them a little bit differently? Okay. I added all of the possible educational eligibilities here, not because you are going to see all of them, because it's very unlikely that you're going to see some of these in your day-to-day practice. I included them more for the emphasis that there are many individuals that you'll be working with that have disability conditions that are DSM, right? So medical conditions that may not fall specifically in any of these areas, or they do, but the term is so different that when you see the report and you're already familiar with the individual, you think that perhaps someone missed something. And maybe that's not the case. It's not that anyone missed anything. The disability condition, the medical condition is probably included somewhere in the report. However, we in the educational setting, our objective is determining educational eligibility. And these are the ones that we have to choose from. And so there may be a discrepancy in that awareness you have of the individual and where we kind of landed in terms of recommendations at the end of the report. And so I emphasize that only because I strictly work on this side, but I have collaborated with individuals kind of on the other side. And that's always an area that seems to be missing in terms of the communication, that yes, I acknowledge that all these other conditions exist, but here the data indicates that the student falls somewhere in one of these areas, okay? And so what are some of those areas? Things like specific learning disability. And so we talked extensively about how we're looking for the cognitive abilities, we're assessing those, we're determining where a student is strong, where there are weaknesses. And so essentially our goal when we're doing that is this: we are trying to determine whether or not a student has deficits in one or more of the basic psychological processes, which are the ones I mentioned before in great detail. And again, how they are impacting an individual. Is it impacting, or are they impacting this individual in things like so listening, right? So more like listening comprehension, thinking, speaking, oral expression, reading, writing, math, spelling, those kind of things. How are those skills impacting an individual? And are they doing it to such a degree that this is a disability condition that we would consider for the student? The little caveat to this area is that it's not a global impairment. If a student is weak in all of those areas, the 7 we talked about before, you are unlikely to see them identified as a student with a specific learning disability, because that's more landing into the intellectual disability neighborhood, that category. You may see individuals who are, in terms of their functioning, a little bit higher in how they score cognitively than would be eligible as a student with intellectual disability, but their skills are still not strong enough to where that pattern of strengths and weaknesses indicates a specific learning disability. You hear that term often referred to as more of a slow learner. And those students, and it's unfortunate, but those students don't fall specifically into any one of the categories, the 13, 14 that I showed you before for educational eligibilities. Sometimes though, you may see those kiddos because they had a concurrent condition, maybe under OHI, and they're being served as other health impaired for ADHD. And I'll talk to you about other health impaired in just a minute. And so that's also very, very relevant information for you to know if you meet an individual and you're reading through the report and the eligibility condition is OHI for ADHD. And so you may assume, well, they must have intact functioning because it's just ADHD. It's the only thing that's impacting them. I really, really, really advise you to go back and look at the cognitive section and think about the elements that we discussed today and really get a better understanding of what each of their areas is telling you. Because you may have a student who, yes, it's OHI for ADHD. That was how we identified them because they had a diagnosis in the medical field, but really their cognition is also very low and is going to present for some obstacles. Okay, so please, please, please always go back and look at the cognitive area. Another area is autism. So I don't know about you, but I meet a lot of individuals who fall in this category. It's one of my joys of my life is to meet kiddos with just such diverse needs and skills. But when you're looking at how an individual becomes eligible for services under this category, it is due to verbal communication, nonverbal communication, and social interaction deficits, okay? And so earlier, as we were beginning our journey together, we talked about the area of communication and how it can encompass the expressive, the receptive. So how does this individual communicate information? How do they understand information? And then pragmatic language, right? And so this is an area that's very, very, very vital for you to kind of look at the communication section, the behavior section, when you're working with an individual that has this eligibility condition. So how does this individual, all individuals with autism are different, how does this individual perform according to these previous evaluations? What is this individual's ability to be able to navigate themselves in these environments? What are their skills at this point? So we may have an individual on the spectrum who cognitively is very bright and very capable, but socialization is their weakness. Having the ability to communicate their needs to professors, to employers, to colleagues is a deficit. Is this a person that's very easily frustrated with simple nuances that other individuals possess? So I'm loud everywhere I go. Is someone with this type of disability condition very easily frustrated because the volume to them is even higher than most individuals are hearing it? And so it's very important that you go back and look and see if you can extract some of this information, because it helps you know then what maybe vocational environments are ideal for an individual that kind of struggles in those ways, or maybe those are strengths for this kiddo. Despite having autism, we actually have developed some incredible coping skills according to the evaluation that allows us to really thrive in environments where we are the model for another. That's an important, vital piece of information. And so just ensure that you're going back into the communication section, into the behavior section, and that you have, again, an awareness, I can't stress cognition enough, of what a student's abilities are according to those, that section, okay? The next really talks about intellectual disability. So as I mentioned before, in order for you to qualify under this section, you have to have abilities that are what is written in the language is sub-average. Well, what does that mean? And it talks about 2 standard deviations below the mean. When I showed you that beautiful bell curve, right, which I really want you to become familiar and love the bell curve, it showed you that average was 100 and 1 standard deviation was 15 points. So someone who's less than 30 points below that average, so 70 and below, right, is going to be in that consideration range for a student with a disability of intellectual disability. However, it does need to be coupled with deficits in adaptive behavior. And so here we go again, where we talk about adaptive behavior. Oh, and adaptive behavior is important for individuals on the spectrum as well. I think I mentioned that before, but I'll mention it again. It's vital here as well. What skills does the individual possess? What can they do independently without need of support from another? And so here you're going to see usually even more detail than you would see with just about any of the other eligibility conditions, because it's explicitly stated in the language for the law, Okay, and so this is where you're going to see maybe more specific examples of in what ways the individual struggles here, according to parents and teachers, or according to observations by the evaluator. Again, because it's specific to the eligibility criteria. I'd love to tell you that every eval is going to be as thorough, but usually this is the one where we emphasize the majority of our energies, because we really have to make a case for, yes, the student is eligible in this area. But it's important for you to know as you're programming for a student to move forward. Usually what you see here is that in individuals with intellectual disability, socialization is not so much the issue. It's more the independence of safety and them understanding that, not everyone that speaks to you is your friend, and, that you shouldn't give individuals that you don't know very, very, very personal information about yourself, or, have them take you home, these kind of things. But that is information that's all very relevant to how you will work with individuals, and that can really be found in this adaptive behavior section, relevant again to the needs of an individual with an intellectual disability. The next one talks about other health impaired. Other health impairment is very tricky because in order for one to qualify as a student with another health impairment, you need to have a chronic or acute health condition, and it needs to impact you in one of three ways in the educational setting. And that's limited strength, your limited vitality, limited alertness. Okay, and so the law states that some of the conditions that may fall under this area are things like asthma, ADHD, diabetes, heart condition, Tourette's, things of that nature. The one that you may see more prevalently, right, is the ADHD. The majority of the kiddos in the educational setting that are served under this condition are served under this condition due to ADHD. There are some that are served under this condition for things like Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, Tourette's, but sometimes Tourette's, the behavioral manifestation of the Tourette's is such that they fall under more of the emotional disturbance, which is the next slide that's coming up. But those are possibilities. So it really kind of depends on the student. And so you'll really have to ensure that when you're heading into that health section, which is where we should delineate within socialization and health, why an individual is being considered as other health impaired, there we should have information about the relevance of what medical condition is having or triggering this evaluation. Why are we looking into the possibility of a disability? And so that can be confusing for some, because you may only ever see it as ADHD. And if someone comes into your office and they have OHI for something else, you might think that it's wrong. That was the inaccurate eligibility. It may not be, because again, we're looking for an acute or chronic health condition that impacts in one of these three ways. Okay. And sometimes it is not the primary disability, it's more secondary, or maybe even a third disability, depending on the need of the student. But at times, a student may no longer meet the criteria for some of those other things, like speech impaired, things like that. And so the OHI kind of starts working its way up into the primary eligibility. The next one talks about an emotional disturbance. So this is another one that is very vital for the work that you do in working with individuals that have now moved into, again, whether it's higher ed environments or vocational settings, is that this presents very differently for different individuals. And so I included in here the different areas under which an individual could qualify as a student with an emotional disturbance, so that you can understand how diverse this eligibility really is. What it says is you have to meet the condition for one or more, and then you'll see them dotted, right? An inability or in an inability, I can't say those together, an inability to learn, and so on and so forth. The inability to build and maintain relationships, inappropriate types of behaviors, the general persuasive mood of unhappiness, depression, and the tendency for some physical symptoms, right? And I won't read them verbatim because you can read them yourself, but you have to demonstrate behaviors that fall into one of these areas. And also then meet the prongs that are at the bottom that say over a long period of time and to a marked degree, obviously with impact and adverse performance within the educational setting. And so this area will be found in that behavioral section, but then most practitioners will incorporate a very short summary of why an individual met eligibility in each of those sections or did not. And that is phenomenal information for you. So you have a student or an individual, I always say individual, they're always students to me, but an individual who qualifies under the area of an emotional disturbance. How do I help them in moving forward, either into a higher ed environment or into, again, a vocational setting. What does that mean for me? Well, it can mean a variety of things. It could mean that you have an individual that has intense crippling anxiety, and so they need some additional supports in knowing how to navigate all of the different dynamics that may come their way in their setting. But once they understand what all of those are and kind of have some systems in place, they're able to navigate very well. I need to know who I can go to. I need to know what the expectation is of me. I need to know my short-term and long-term goals. Like that, we just need to remain involved in kind of all the process. Another might have crippling anxiety and may not need to know anything but what needs to come that day. And so all of that information will be encompassed in this evaluation for you to know how to work with the individual that you are charged with working with. And again, there's some other sections in here that may be relevant to you specifically. So I won't talk about each one of them, but the inappropriate types of feelings under normal circumstances. You may have individuals that really struggle with regulation. And so their main difficulty is knowing how to calm themselves down, process information that they're hearing that's distasteful to them. They don't want to do the task. They don't want to follow through, whatever kind of their motivation might be. But again, this is relevant. What you want to know is whether or not this is an individual that's going to need more support into slowly integrating themselves into the environment that you plan for them, versus just kind of leaving them there and kind of hoping for the best, or thinking, well, we already had talked about the expectations, so I thought things were going to go great. This may be an individual that needs more kind of checking in with them, more processing through, or a little bit more time before you already expose them to the environment that ultimately you want them to be in. I know in the vocational setting, there's goals that are involved and things like that. This might have to be one of the goals that's incorporated. How do we navigate responding to individuals in such a way that is appropriate for the environment that we're in, and coupling that with, again, kind of whatever your long-term goal is. Food for thought for y'all, because I know that individuals coming in with this eligibility can feel overwhelming. They don't have to be. It just really is about you going through these areas and figuring out what it was about them that had this be the eligibility criteria that became the best representation of where they were. Okay. So the next couple slides just really talk to you about like what modifications and accommodations are going to look like when you're looking through those reports. And so I'm going to kind of skim through those so I can show you one of the reports that I have, because I've been talking for a long time. I don't want to run out of time. But one of the things that is relevant for you guys to understand, and so I put it here in this slide, went too far, is the notion that accommodations, when you hear accommodations, it's really that the difference between and with modifications is a difference between leveling the playing field. So when you're talking accommodations, you are attempting to, or we are, to give an individual access to what's going on around them, to their curricular environment. Okay, and so we're going to provide them things like extra time, shortened assignments, or let's see, what's another one? Modified verbalizations with simplified language. So I'm just attempting to give you access to what's going on around you in a way that's beneficial to you. Modifications really talk about changing it up for them, right? So now the assignment that they have to do has been changed in such a way to where this is individualized to this particular person, right? So I maybe will take an assignment that's 40 problems, and I will change it up to where this individual only has to do 10, but I'm still able to determine that they understand the content. And so this is vital for you to know as you're looking through paperwork, because I spoke earlier about evaluations and being eligible and those kind of things. You may have a student who comes with a report and it's still relevant data to that student, but the end conclusion wasn't that the student required special education. Which requires a need for specialized instruction, a need for something different in your educational plan than what you could have access to in just gen ed. You may have an individual that comes to you with a 504 plan, and generally 504 plans only offer accommodations, because it really speaks to the fact that while maybe, yes, a report, an evaluation, a FIE indicated that an individual did have some markers of a disability condition, such as ADHD, perhaps a student didn't need anything different in the classroom other than some accommodations to level the playing field, some of the extra time, reminders to stay on task, those kind of things. And so that's why I really wanted to kind of put that difference in here for you as you're working with diverse clientele, right? Because you may have individuals that come in with just a 504 plan, and so they need something, but the need might be different. Their ability to move along in the goals that you create for them might also be different, because again, these individuals might have different coping strategies, different skill sets that are going to benefit them in that manner. Okay. So I just kind of put that in there for you guys to see. I want to show you very quickly a report that I have that kind of breaks all those things down. And so it's, I think, easier for you to see in vivo when I say, look for these areas and look for these other areas, if I can actually show you what that looks like. So I think what I will do is that I will show you Leslie. And Leslie Nielsen is a student that was determined eligible as other health impaired. And so I can see you, Dr. Roberts, you see Leslie's report, just a thumbs up is good. Okay, great. And so Leslie's report is broken down into a lot of the areas that we just talked about. Okay, and so I did attempt to incorporate some history for little Leslie. So Leslie was a student that came in from another district, and so it was relevant to include that the evaluation that we were doing was because someone else had determined Leslie eligible as other health impaired for ADHD. And so now this was my attempt to determine whether or not we still saw those things and what that meant for Leslie moving forward. Okay, and so in terms of health history, I incorporated that Leslie's physician had, prior to this day, already provided some information that said, yes, in fact, Leslie does have this medical condition outside of the scope of the schools that indicates that Leslie has ADHD. Parent information was provided. So this, again, the relevance here is beyond just knowing that obviously he has some moments at home where he's taxing to his mother, but this is the manifestation of those difficulties in the real world environment, right? In the real world environment, we are impulsive, we engage in some lying, we have incredible mood swings, we're not always getting along with our siblings, and at times seeking them out specifically to get under their skin. And so definitely attributes that if Leslie were an 18-year-old, 19-year-old individual would be very relevant for you to understand in your environment. What does that mean for me and how I work with the student if I know that maybe these are behaviors that sometimes impede Leslie's functioning, okay? Sometimes get in the way of Leslie being able to successfully complete tasks. And so that's just some information from the parent. Very similar information was echoed by the teachers about the lack of truthfulness. And I use that term because it just seems a lot nicer than calling Leslie a liar. But they indicated very similar things. In the classroom setting, we're not always following through with tasks. We're not always completing work the way that we should. Sometimes we appear as if we are, but we're watching YouTube videos. And so again, relevant for you and going well is an environment where Leslie has a lot of independence and there's not an individual to monitor the follow through with the tasks that we are asking Leslie to do. Is that going to be the most relevant place for Leslie? Probably not. Maybe we still need to be in a setting where we have additional individuals that are kind of floating around and where Leslie's not charged with completing a task in isolation, right? Like on their own. Moving forward a little bit further down, we see information that really talks about, sorry, this is scrolling very funny. Sorry, y'all. I don't want to give anyone like a headache trying to scroll down on this report. Okay, sorry, second monitor. If we scroll down, I did attempt to put in here just like a descriptive category for the different scores, again, for folks that are unfamiliar with assessments of this kind. So I do try to think of individuals like yourselves when I write my reports. Here you'll see the data broken down. So again, when I showed you the bell curve and it included standard scores, it included scaled scores, and scaled scores is something I didn't talk to you a lot about, but there are assessments that when you go to print out your data, they don't give you a standard score. So this can be confusing to individuals, again, who don't work in the field as I do, but a scaled score can still give you relevant information. There, the average is 10 and the standard deviation is going to be 3. It's on your bell curve. You don't need to remember it off of face value. Just put a star on that slide. But again, it gives you relevant information here to know that these are clearly areas where he's struggling, right? Areas where I would need to put a little bit more emphasis when I'm working with him or creating goals or again, placing him in more of a higher ed kind of environment. And so we know that he processes information well. He's got good fluid reasoning. So information that's new to him, he shouldn't struggle with processing too much because this is a strength for him. His working memory is not too far from the average. It's only about 3 points. So he should be able to recall information long enough to complete a task. He should not require as many repetitions as he's clearly getting in the classroom because he's distracting himself with other tasks. His processing speed, the ability to complete tasks rapidly was good, but where he was really struggling was more in this area. And so we really talked about this being vocabulary, this being all the experiences he's had throughout his life, and how that acquired knowledge now benefits him in his environment. And so this may be a kiddo that, even though his memory is good and he should be able to recall information, when you're communicating with him, you may have to use terminology that is more common language and having to be more simplified. And not because he's not a bright kiddo, but because he's not aware of that information. He doesn't have that in his vernacular. And so I might not use the word vernacular with this particular kiddo, so as to not kind of confuse whatever message I'm attempting to give him. Let's see. Moving forward, we had some information about academics as well. And so that's in here. I want you to look at, though, and I apologize for anyone that's moving too fast for, but I want you to look at more of the formal behavior information that was included in this report. So because Leslie is a kiddo with ADHD, really the emphasis here for me was, how does that ADHD impact Leslie in the classroom? And so you are very often going to see these charts, and this is something that's called the BASC, and it gives you a breakdown of a variety of behaviors that an individual can have. And so earlier we talked about individuals who are categorized as emotional disturbance, right? Generally, you will see a chart of this kind or some representation of this data in some form or fashion on a report. And essentially what it's expecting you to know about the individual is that they struggle with these areas, or that they're average for them. And so I do have a key for you that's a little bit higher above, but for the sake of not moving this chart too much for you, I'll just tell you that the scores that are AR, you'll see them denoted as the number and then a slash and AR. Those are numbers that are at risk. It's in the description right above, but essentially that just tells you that these are problem behaviors for an individual. Everything that's AV is average. Some folks will spell out average so that you know this is not a concern for the individual, and they'll spell out things like at risk. The highest level of concern for this type of data on a BASC is clinically significant, or I would have put CS. But again, it just gives you information so that as an outside individual looking at this chart, you go, well, if I'm looking at numbers that are at risk or clinically significant, and I don't see any, then that means that for the most part, this individual is not presenting with externalizing behaviors, internalizing behaviors, problems that I should be concerned about moving forward with a student. They must possess sufficient coping skills, because otherwise you would have seen those elevations here. Maybe on another occasion I could show you one with ED, but I went with this kiddo because he kind of had a couple of sections that I needed. But again, this is something that you'll be looking at. These numbers are different than what you normally see with standard scores and scaled scores. But generally what you're looking for here is that, again, the higher the number, the more concern. The key is always found above because individuals add it in that way. And again, you'll be looking at the left-hand side for what those areas mean. There's usually a summary too in terms of the data. The student struggles with hyperactivity and aggression. And it should be coupled with informal data that you're receiving from other sources as well. So this is Leslie. And like I said, there's also some information here about executive functioning. So there's another form, which is this one, that really talks to you about how a student with ADHD may or may not be struggling in their environment. Most people attempt to give you a key to each of these areas. As you see on the right-hand side, I told you exactly what inattention is. So that if you're thinking, well, what does that mean for Leslie? Well, it means he struggles in these areas. He struggles with concentration, hyperactivity, what have you. So yes, this is what a standalone report looks like. I'm sure many of you are thinking, they never look like that when they reach my desk. Why is yours so different from everyone else's? Well, I'll tell you, because most individuals write them standalone and then they cut and paste into a system, into a special ed software system. And so you'll probably more than likely see it in that format, not this format. I'm sorry, it doesn't always look that concise, but the elements are all the same. And so you're still gonna look for everything we talked about today. And so that being said, the last slide on my PowerPoint just said questions. Does anybody have any questions?
Sure, a lot of people are feeling not overwhelmed, but like mind blown. Like I did not realize there was so much in there that I should be looking at, right? We did have one question, and it's asking about OHI and does cancer fit into OHI?
I've never seen it fit into OHI. The reality is that when you're doing an evaluation of that kind, you really have to then tease out, well, let's talk about how this condition is impacting the student. And so I'm not going to say no, never, because I think that it is one of those things that would need to be considered on an like as it's occurring basis. But the evaluation that's done by the school is still going to tease out all those elements based on cancer and the individual having this condition that's impacting them. What does that mean for the student in the school setting? What can they or not access because they now have cancer? And so I'm not going to say no, because it's just never come across my desk, but we're living in weird times. And so there could be a possibility. I think that it's going to depend on what it is that the school district found in all those other elements. And sometimes they may have very relevant data that says that a student didn't struggle at all. Yes, they have this condition, and so they miss and they have to make up the work when they get back. But when they get back, they're able to kind of jump right back on track, and they're doing really well. And despite this situation that they're having to navigate, we're not seeing the impact here. We still have friends, and there's all these other things going on. And so in a situation like that, where we're not seeing the educational need piece of it, you may have an individual that then falls under maybe more of a 504 plan for some accommodations due to the impact that the cancer might have. So I have to go out for a lot of treatment, and maybe additional time to complete tasks would be very relevant for me, right? And very beneficial. And so that's kind of where you think, I've never seen it, but maybe they would fall under a 504 if all those other elements are still trekking along successfully for the individual. That's a good question.
Yeah, that's the only one we have so far, but if anyone has one, you can unmute yourself and ask. I was going to say something too, because you mentioned in there, like if they have SLD in all areas, it's actually probably an intellectual disability, so you won't see that, but that's not completely true. Sometimes we do see that, and we know like, oh, wow, this is probably not correct. You can't have an SLD in all areas. This probably is, something else going on. Right. And so just kind of making aware of that, because I've seen reports that did not come from you, from other, from other districts. Right. And you see that SLD all the way across the board, and you're like, oh, you can't have that. That's not, but you do see it.
It's going to be that when you're thinking of the breakdown of the areas for SLD, there's, like I mentioned, there's basic reading, reading comprehension, reading fluency, there's written expression, there's a variety. And so one of the areas that sometimes individuals or students, they don't fall under is listening comprehension, oral expression, but they're part of the areas you could fall under for specific learning disability. And so practitioners, we are all individuals with big hearts. I want to generalize us in that way, right? And so sometimes we will fall into the practice of identifying a student that is struggling in all academic areas because they're struggling, and we really want to see them receive support, even though their profile is not indicative of a specific learning disability. And the way that sometimes, again, with our big hearts, we try to reason that away is saying, oh, but it wasn't, listening comprehension and oral expression, or it wasn't one area, but it was all of these others. And so it can be very tricky. But again, you understanding how each relevant area, like what that means for you and what that means for the individual you're working for, I think will on many occasions be much more beneficial than just knowing the eligibility condition. So yes, they're LD. Thank you for the paperwork, fantastic. But let me go back and really tease through these sections and get a better understanding of where this person is individually, because they may be SLD and you go, well, but most of the folks that I've worked with that are SLD in something, specific learning disabled in something, they do really well with the goals that we create for them or the placements that we have, in higher ed, so this one should probably do the same. They might not. I would really advise that you go back and you kind of read through all those sections. Let's see. I've seen records where students meet SLD in all areas. Absolutely. I've seen it also. And I've seen it on the flip side where I need to reevaluate a student. So we talked a little bit about how kids have to be reevaluated every 3 years. And sometimes it can be just informal data because it's sufficient to continue to serve a student, or it's like retesting in all areas. And so it becomes more of a formal evaluation, but it's still considered either a full individual evaluation or that review of existing evaluation data. So I've been in situations where I'm completing one of those and I have a student who prior to me meeting the student was eligible in all these ways. And there are some caveats in the law about not removing a student's eligibility in this area. It's a commissioner's rule. If they were placed that way before, it's very tricky and very, very complicated, but I've seen them as well. OHI with a 60 intellectual disability. Well, and the reality is I've seen some individuals in that area as well, because there's a stark difference, I think, from how much data we collect in our environment and sometimes what data is necessary in a physician's office when a family is going in and say, I'm struggling with my child, they're engaging in these behaviors. And, for those of you that have met individuals that are in a 60 IQ range, but maybe didn't fall under intellectual disability, because maybe adaptive behaviors were not there, or even better yet, let's say like a 73, which is still kind of low, but it doesn't fall within that marker. They are going to have some difficulties with attention and recall and some of the very similar markers to what a doctor is looking for ADHD. And so sometimes they come in and they're coded OHI because a physician diagnosed them with this condition. And so, yeah, it's tricky. It's very tricky. Would you please clarify what we said about informal observations for reevals? So when we are looking at reevaluating a student, so let's just say little Timmy has been receiving services as emotional disturbance for the last 3 years. It's time to reevaluate them. And the eligibility criteria that they met 3 years ago, those are all still very relevant issues for the student at the time of considering a reevaluation. So if we say, well, looking at teacher data, looking at referrals like behavioral referrals, looking at parent data, observing the student in the classroom, we can see that everything about this individual indicates that they still have this condition. They still struggle with dysregulation, with aggressive behavior, with whatever it is that they qualified under. We may decide that that's not the best time to go ahead and gather like behavior rating scales, putting the student through the whole process of sitting down and doing formal cognitive testing or achievement testing. We may just gather all that other information, which is still wonderful data, and we may write that up as the new eligibility report, right? And we might say everything about the previous evaluation is still relevant, and so we're kind of summarizing some of that data. The reason we make that recommendation is because currently the student is described as struggling in all of these ways. And so that the relevance for you of evaluations that include informal data versus formal data, especially with older kiddos, is that if we have had a student who has been identified as a student with autism, let's just say, and intellectual disability might fall under the same kind of conversation, but autism, and we've known that about them since they were 3. And so every year or every 3 years as necessary, we've done some combination of gathering data, but now they're reaching 16 years old and it's time to do another eval. But everything about all of the data prior to this, and we have access to all the reports, so that's where it gets tricky for you that don't have access to them. Everything about the student indicates that yes, the student is still on the spectrum, right? The student still has autism. We may decide at that time that it's not a good use of that student's energies to sit through this entire process all over again. And so we'll just collect information informally through interviews, again, observations, pulling through records we might have about any referrals, and again, any absences of excessive visits to nurse, whatever we can get our hands on, and just incorporate that into the new updated eval. So it becomes informal because no one sat and tested the student face to face, if you will. There were no rating scales, things of that kind. I hope that answers your question. Would it make sense for this to be put in a speech and after several conversations due to the COVID restrictions on in-person learning? In a speech or whatever. So put what in? What we're talking about, the informal language, like informal data? Yes, it can be. There have been a couple kiddos. So there was one, at least for me this school year, that was due very, very early on. And so I wasn't as familiar with the student. The teachers that had been working on the campus had been working with the student for many, many years. It was my first year. And so yeah, beginning of the school year is very difficult to determine for me whether or not this is what's going on. But then I had to lean very heavily on all of the data that they already had collected for the student from their work the previous school year, despite COVID, because we're still seeing each other virtually and what have you. And so yes, you could, and you say up to this moment in time, this is where we are for the student. This is what we know. This is what needs a student continues to possess. However, the caveat always becomes that we are mandated to reevaluate in some capacity, formal or informal, right? Every 3 years. However, if we needed to come back within that window because something occurred that made us think, oh, we really need to come back and make some considerations about present levels or of functioning and performance or actual eligibility. So in your situation for your speech student, I'll give you like a hypothetical. let's say you were suspecting that there were some other atypical behaviors going on, and you were suspecting that it was autism. I'll just say that. And we just got back. And so I haven't really been able to see you very much. All of these restrictions are very, very odd. And so we may say, everything about your speech continues to be a concern. We're going to continue to recommend that eligibility. However, if these other behaviors that we were noting, but we didn't have enough data to substantiate moving forward, and again, we're still in the middle of this very weird, maybe virtual learning experience. If all of those things continue to be an obstacle for the student, then the ARD committee can come back and request actually gathering that information in a formal manner. So yes, you could. We always like to get it one-stop shop, but we live in kind of weird times right now. And so sometimes you have to just make those concessions and say, we can always come back if we need to. You're welcome. Anybody else? These are great questions, y'all. I feel like some of you have specific students that you're thinking about. Can we informally evaluate a student that's in high school but intends to go to college? You can. So like I said, in the situation of a kiddo that's in that grade level, and so you already have tons of information about what it is that they need. You can have, it still goes in. I don't want you to think that it's informal in the way of not having to have the same kind of restrictions about, can you guys still hear me? Nope. Okay, good. My internet. We still have to have the same elements. You'll still need consent from guardians. You'll still need to write it up the way that an FIE would be written up, or like a read document. So you still do all of those things. It's more about the type of data that you're collecting. And so there is such a thing as saying, well, we're not, what's the word I'm looking for? We're not doubting eligibility, right? We completely all together, here's an ARD committee, agree that the student continues to have autism. And so that's not in question, but what we're really much more curious about is the manifestation and implications of that autism. So we have this student, and even though they're not due for their 3-year reeval, or they are, but we don't necessarily care about determining that we're still eligible as autism. We believe that. We just want to know what the implications are of autism on this student in this environment. Can we gather data that answers that question? And it's one of the options on the consent that the parents provide us. We always have to fully inform that. And that's my conversation with the parents. I don't discount that your student still has this condition. I want to know more what the implication is and what additional supports we might need to adjust. Can I gather data for just that? And then I've been able to have the liberty of gathering it in whatever format I wanted, informal interviews, observations, those kind of things. Or if I felt like I still needed more and wanted some formal rating scales or testing, then I could kind of incorporate that. But yes, you can. It's really an ARD committee conversation and decision about the scope of the assessment that's done with the student. That's a good question.
Thank you. Just because we do contract out a diagnostician, and she was mentioning that once they want to go to college, that the college will require a recent 3 evaluation. Yeah. So I have like 5 reads coming up, and they're all high school students. So that's why I wanted to make sure.
Well, and that's the discrepancy between the objective of our eval for us and for college that they may be applying to, question and conversation. Because on the school side, is it appropriate for me to complete an evaluation where I only gather information that's informal? Because I already know all these other questions about the student. Yes. But that's because my report and my evaluation in my environment, so I'm thinking I'm a public school, right? Is that I want to determine the educational need, how that continues to look for the student. And so my answer still stands, but where it gets tricky for you is there are universities that want an updated evaluation that has formal cognition, so cognitive testing, and formal achievement testing. And so that's like a whole different, I think, complication, because they're attempting to use it for a different purpose than what we are intending to write it for. And so I think that's definitely going to be necessary for you to ensure that you're having conversations with the specific individuals that you're thinking of, like the 5, and understanding like the university environment that they might be going into and what they're requesting. But the scope of, I think, your obligation is to answer those 2 questions for the student. And so yours is a little trickier. I would maybe gather some additional information about what school they're going to, what they need, and why that's the case. And maybe even and I've never done this because I've not been at secondary in a very long time, but maybe even reaching out to the individuals who review that information at the higher ed environment and just asking, what is it exactly you're looking for? Because maybe that's where the discrepancy is. Colleges can complete an evals while they charge $50. Is that what that says? Is that the right period in the right place? just for my sake. Yes. Okay.
I mean, I think it all depends. I mean, I know like A&M, you know, they have a center and they can do it, and you can get in line. And so if you get in line to get the evaluation to the university, and I did want to mention something about the university too, you know, and they're more concerned about the evaluation, and I think we all need to become more concerned about the evaluation than the accommodations and the modifications and the classes the students are in, because oftentimes those other things tell you more about what they're used to and what we're giving them than what their need is, you know, and colleges are more interested in what the need is. And so that's why they're really concerned about the evaluation, and why we need to make sure the evaluations are accurate, because, you know, they're not saying, okay, so you got all these accommodations, that's fine, but that your needs don't show that. And we're only interested in providing accommodations for needs. And that's what colleges do. Whenever, you know, in the public school setting, there's various reasons. Maybe we're really nice. Maybe someone's really pushing things. Maybe a parent's really pushing, hey, we want this, you know, this have access to the, you know, content mastery, which then would, you know, be equivalent to like a tutoring center or something. But the reality is the student doesn't have that need. It's just someone was really pushing it, and the school's being nice or not wanting to be sued, go ahead and provide this accommodation, this modification. Whenever you look at the evaluation, you see that it wasn't actually needed. And so that's why we really have to focus on those evaluations to know what's needed versus what the student's getting, and not that what they're getting is irrelevant, because they might have been getting it for a very long time, and now it's become a need, right? I mean, if they're used to their tests being read to them, even though maybe, you know, they don't have a specific learning disability and reading comprehension or into other reading areas, well, now it's a need, because for years and years they've had things read to them, and this is now what they know, how they know how to take a test, you know. And so it is relevant, but now maybe I'm not going to be able to get those accommodations, but I need to help you know that this is how you learn, and you're going to figure out, you need to get your computer, start getting used to your computer reading test to you, or your electronic device, and that way that you still have that accommodation that you're not going to get when you're in college, or, you know, definitely not going to get in a work environment.
Ms. Smith comments here that maybe, again, advice would be to just contact the disability office to inquire what exactly it is that they need. So what information are you seeking? Because she does say it depends on the size of the college or the university. So before you jump right in, Ms. Valencia, into completing those assessments, maybe just gathering a little bit of information about what schools specifically the individual is maybe, you know, wanting to gather this information for. And then that way you're providing what the student is asking for, but you're also kind of avoiding maybe doing something you don't need to do. So yeah, I would inquire a little bit further.
Well, I found too, it's not even necessarily the size, it's just what school they're going to, because locally we have a small one and we have a big one. The small one is more strict than the big one, quite honestly, and what they require and what accommodations they provide. Students have an easier time of getting accommodations and getting in with disability services at A&M than they do at our community college. Wow. You know, and that can't tell you what the reason why. I mean, I think it's getting better, but I think it just depends on the school more than even the size.
Awesome. Any other questions? Those were great questions thus far. Anything else that you guys are curious about or need clarified? I speak very fast, so there's probably something that right past.
Well, I posted a few times. I mean, this will be up on our website as what the PowerPoint information. I don't know if do you want to provide your Word document too, since that was Leslie Nielsen and not a real person, and then if they want to look at it, because I know they were having trouble seeing it because you weren't focused, and I didn't get a chance to tell you because you were talking so fast.
Okay, I will seek to make sure I'm de-identifying everything possible, and then yes, I will get you this Word document just so you guys have a sample of the things that I was talking about and kind of what that means in vivo. Again, my caveat to you is look like this because you very rarely get the Word document. You get the cut and paste version into a school-based special education software. And so just kind of think about that. That's my caveat when you start looking at it and go, these two documents look very different. They will. They will.
All right. Well, thank you all. And we have put the link for our satisfaction survey. Please go and complete that for us. I put lots of links throughout. So but if you have any questions, let us know. This will be up hopefully on our site next week. Hey, Jeanette, really great job. I really appreciate it. And I know everyone else did. We got a lot of useful information and very helpful.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, you guys have a great rest of your afternoon, and I may or may not see you again. Bye, everyone.
Bye, y'all.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.